Hello everyone. It's been a long time since we have interacted, and I guess it's been a couple of weeks. But today I have with me, the HLAG committee report. HLAG is High Level Advisory Group, which was constituted under the Ministry of Commerce and Industry in 2018, and it has submitted its report just on the 30th of October. It's really interesting because I've read a lot of government reports, over the years, and this report stands out in the sense that its focus is a lot more diverse, and it's not just another report which is talking about export promotion, etc. But it is much more like a roadmap for a $5 trillion economy by 2024-25. Some of the broad suggestions, but first of all, I'd like you to know that the report can be downloaded from the Quality Council of India's website. So you guys can go through the report because it has some excellent suggestions for a lot of sectors. For instance, it has specific recommendations for pharmaceuticals, biotechnology, textile, medical devices, garments, apparels, electronics, and agriculture. So what in a sense the report does is that it provides a macroeconomic recommendation framework which is required for the economy at the moment, and it also provides sector specific recommendations. Now because we have a paucity of time, we'll not be able to go through each sector, but I'll still run you through some of the recommendations made by the committee and why they are important. In fact, one of the recommendation has already been partially implemented because the report bats for a corporate income tax rate of 22% with exemptions. At present, the recent corporate tax cut was at 22% without exemptions. So it shows that somewhere we are moving in that direction, and it is important to recognize that reducing corporate taxes is important to make our firms competitive and allow them to scale over a period of time. So that's one part of the story. Apart from that, it has very focused suggestions on export-import policy, specifically with respect to agriculture. This report bats for complete liberalization of agriculture, which I think should happen at some point in the near future, because agriculture as a sector will benefit from less government control than what has been. In fact, there are states chief ministers group which has been constituted already, which is looking at how to make changes in the APMC Act which protect the farmers' interests and benefits them over a longer period of time. A couple of other suggestions are to do with cost of capital. Now it's very important to recognize that when a business is set up in India, there are 2 or 3 major cost components which impact its competitiveness, because competitiveness is at the end of the day how cheaply can you produce a commodity. So it's in a sense very important to recognize these 3 aspects. First is taxation, and we have discussed that we have reduced the tax rate for corporates, so somehow we have dealt with that aspect. The other 2 are labor and cost of capital. So cost of capital directly depends on interest rates, and it is precisely there where the report has a lot of bold suggestions. We do need to reduce cost of capital, there is no doubt about it, and there are 2 aspects to it. First is the RBI, which needs to be a little more aggressive with the repo rate cuts, and banks need to pass on this transmission, so that's there. And the other aspect which is equally important is the labor cost, and people think that in India wages are low, but when we look at productivity adjusted wages, which is the right metric to compare wages in India, China, etc., India's productivity adjusted wages are higher. So labor cost is also not that cheap that people conventionally believe it to be. So there are 2 things that need to be done. We need to increase productivity, and with that probably productivity adjusted wages will move in the right direction. And second is to recognize that because a lot of our workforce is still predominantly dependent upon labor, on agriculture, that puts a lot of pressure on the total functioning of the labor market in the manufacturing sector. So labor supply for manufacturing sector is relatively not that robust in that sense, and that's why wages do not adjust. In fact, since several planning commission plans we've discussed, debated, and extensively put in place policy roadmap to take a significant chunk of our population out of agriculture, but somehow we haven't been able to do that. So it is important to recognize that remains a challenge, and this report provides a lot of policy suggestions which will help this transition take place. The reason why they identify specific sectors is very clear. They have identified 10 odd winners, so to say. Now these are areas where India has a competitive advantage, say over China, Vietnam, etc., which means that if we make the right push in these directions, we will be able to capture a greater share of world trade. Now a lot of people have said that world exports, India's exports has not really increased, and India's share of exports has remained stagnant for nearly 2 decades now. What people don't realize is that though the share has remained stagnant, we have moved away from textiles, which used to dominate some 2 decades ago, now to higher value services or even electronics. So there is this reorientation of our exports that has happened. Not to say that textiles should not be a competitive sector in India. In fact, we can be very competitive in textiles. Some of the reasons why we haven't been competitive in the textiles is because of the FTAs, etc., and because the textile sector didn't get the necessary push over the last 2 decades or so. So this report bats for some of those changes which are urgently required. To cut the long story short, I think these 10 sectors that they have identified, we have a big advantage, and this is the most opportune time to hit the nail where it hurts the most, and ensure that some of these recommendations can be implemented swiftly, so that India can grow its exports at a decent rate, because exports it's as mentioned even in the report, as mentioned even during the release of the report, there is virtually no country which has grown at 7.5% with without robust export growth. So exports growth is very important for India to achieve 7.5-8% of growth rate, and it is pretty much doable even in the current climate where protectionism is on the rise and world trade is not growing as fast as it used to be. Even in such a climate, it is very much possible for India to increase its export and world share. There's a lot of optimism with this report coming out, and especially because some of its bold recommendations have already been implemented or accepted by the government, such as the corporate income tax rates, because that was one of the boldest moves in India's taxation history, at least in the 20 decades that I have personally gone through the data of world corporate tax rates. I think that was one of the biggest corporate tax cuts in the world, and if I look at the cut to 15%, then that is definitely the highest corporate tax cut over in the 21st century. So we have taken that big move, which reassures that some of these moves are very likely going to happen over the next couple of months or over the 1 year. So we should be very optimistic about the medium term outlook on India, and 7.5%, 8% growth is actually a foregone conclusion if we are to implement these recommendations.